Bona tarda, benvinguts. Moltes gràcies per ser aquí. Us he de dir que aquest aplaudiment jo crec que anirà fantàstic, perquè la Chimamanda, pobra, està cansada. Va arribar ahir, havia de volar directament des de Washington per culpa de la vaga, va haver de fer una escala a Alemanya, ha sigut una mica complicat, però finalment és aquí i jo crec que, ara em deia, estic una mica cansada però tinc ganes de trobar-me amb la gent, jo crec que aquest aplaudiment d'alguna manera l'haurà revifat. I think that's what you needed, right?
Yes.
Let me do, please, a short introduction. Com us deia, moltes gràcies per ser aquí, moltes gràcies als que sou a la sala d'aquí al costat, moltes gràcies també a la gent que ho està seguint amb streaming, es pot veure en directe des de la web del diari Ara i també a la web, evidentment, del CCCB. Hi ha diverses entitats que han fet possible aquest acte. La Chimamanda feia molts anys que teníem ganes que fos a Barcelona i avui és aquí gràcies al CCCB, també a Penguin Random House, a Casa Àfrica i al PEN Català. Per tant, a tots ells, moltíssimes gràcies per fer-ho possible. Dir-vos que durant la xerrada podreu tuitejar, hi ha un hashtag que és Chimamanda CCCB i us demanem que ho feu a través dels comptes CCCB i CCCB de debats. Quan us heu assegut, segurament a la cadira haureu trobat un full. Si voleu omplir-lo, us enviaran informació. És el butlletí de notícies periòdiques del Centre de Documentació i Debat del CCCB. Si l'ompliu, després, quan acabem l'acte, us explicaré on s'ha de deixar. Ara mateix no ho tinc clar, però segur que després m'ho diran. Dir-vos que farem una mica de conversa i després podreu fer preguntes. Us ho dic per si ja les voleu anar pensant. Segurament tindrem poc temps i us demanaré, sisplau, que sigueu el més breu possibles perquè tothom tingui l'oportunitat de fer-li preguntes a ella. Jo crec que avui, sempre quan fem aquests actes, fem unes presentacions bastant àmplies sobre el personatge. Jo diria que avui no fa gaire falta. Hi ha 700 persones al CCCB, les entrades es van esgotar al juliol, això vol dir que tots sabeu perfectament qui és la Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Tot i així, per si de cas, si m'ho permeteu, faig una molt breu introducció. La Chimamanda és una escriptora nigeriana. Als 18 anys ella se'n va anar als Estats Units a estudiar i ara viu entre Nigèria i Amèrica. El seu país, Nigèria, sempre apareix a la seva obra. A les seves dues primeres novel·les ella ens parlava principalment, o hi sortia, la guerra de Biafra, que va ser la guerra civil a Nigèria, que va passar entre el 67 i l'any 70. Era La flor púrpura i A medio sol amarillo. Després s'ha acabat? Ah, no, sí. Després arribaria una altra novel·la, Americana, on el que ella feia precisament és utilitzar aquest terme que pel que sembla a Nigèria té un punt despectiu per anomenar aquestes persones que se'n van als Estats Units i després tornen algunes amb una certa superioritat. Al llibre ella explica què vol dir per una nigeriana marxar allà, ens parla de la Ifemelu, que no descobreix fins que és allà què vol dir ser negra. De fet, no descobreix que és negra fins que no arriba allà. La Chimamanda va començar a escriure ja de molt petita. També de molt petita era feminista. De fet, ella era feminista abans de saber que existia aquesta paraula. Ens ho ha transmès a través de 2 llibres, Tots hauríem de ser feministes i Estimada Ijeawele, manifest feminista en 15 consells, on ella dona uns consells a una amiga seva perquè pugui educar la seva filla en el feminisme. No m'enrotllo més, comencem a sentir-la a ella. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello. You said it would be a short introduction.
Yeah, sorry.
I realized that
I just wanted to have you rest a little bit more.
I think that there's certain things that Nigerians and Spanish people have in common.
But now you'll be doing the talking. I will just ask a few questions. I said, I don't know if you could hear it, that you were a feminist, even when you were a child, even before knowing the meaning of the word feminist.
Yes. So when I'm asked when I became a feminist, it's hard for me to say because I've always been, which is to say that I was the child who was very aware of the double standards. You know, when I was very young, I don't remember when I wasn't aware that the world extends courtesies to men, that it doesn't extend to women. that there are double standards, that women are often very rigidly constrained by the idea of their roles than men, but that men are also rigidly constrained. When I was a little girl, I was very observant, and I would, so for example, in Igbo culture, breaking the kola nut is very central. When people come to visit you, you present the kola nut, there's prayers, blessings, and it's a ritual that I find quite beautiful. And, when I was very young, I realized women couldn't break the kola nut. And I remember asking an uncle, and he said, well, women can't, as though, of course, it's obvious. And I remember thinking it just didn't make sense. I mean, there was an absurdity for me in the idea that because you are a woman was a reason. It didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. I also, so in my family growing up, my parents were, for the time and place, my parents were quite progressive. As to the question of whether my mother or my father was a feminist, probably not in the way that, no. But it was sort of that we were a family that was more progressive in a place that wasn't necessarily progressive. So my parents were good friends. They went to walk together. They had lunch together. They talked about everything together. My father considered the things that my mother did to be very important, and I think she considered what he did to be very important. But at the same time, when we were growing up, we had domestic help, for example. So they would do most of the cooking and cleaning, but my mother made sure that all her children learned how to clean. Boys and girls, everybody had to clean. But when it came to cooking, she would say to me, go stay in the kitchen so you can learn. And my brothers would go off to play ball. And all I wanted to do was to go play ball. But I couldn't. And so I noticed these sorts of little things. And I had an aunt who was married to a man who I thought was just a charming monster. And I remember when the story came that he had a child with another woman. And I remember how even the women in my family were saying to her, don't throw away your marriage. At least he comes home to you, that sort of thing. And I remember that she was distraught. But at the same time, I remember that what she then did was to change to add his first name to the last name she already had, which is to say, it was kind of a gesture of, in my opinion, it was sort of a complete giving up, and I remember feeling angry on her behalf and thinking, why do we live in a society that tells a woman to swallow injustice and bear it? And why is everybody complicit in this? So I was a child who was a bit of a troublemaker. I would ask questions, I would push back. I think some of my relatives found me quite irritating, which is fine.
Even when they taught you how to sit, for example.
Oh, my mother, my aunts, and this is quite common for young women growing up in Nigeria. And I should say southern Nigeria, because I don't really know the north well, because it's quite different. But in general, that idea of you're sitting down and an adult tells you, sit properly like a woman or sit properly like a girl. I don't know if there are any, African sisters, yep. Yep, and they're like, sit like a girl, sit with your legs. And I remember being in the kitchen once, and I was sort of straddling the little stool, and I was watching the house help. He was preparing coconuts, which I loved. So I was just sitting there waiting for the coconuts to be ready. And an aunt of mine comes in, she's like, why are you sitting like that? Sit properly. And her tone was so full of sort of panic. I thought something terrible had happened, right? And I was like, wait, what's wrong? She's like, sit with your legs closed. And I was maybe 9 or 8. So the idea that so early on we start teaching girls that their bodies are about shame, that our bodies are things that we cannot have control over, we should feel ashamed of. Because I remember thinking, even then as a child, the kitchen in my family home, why is this even a problem? Right? And I was made to feel bad for sitting comfortably on a chair. And because the point is that sitting as I was sitting was very comfortable. I don't find it comfortable to sit like that. I think it's, I kind of like to lounge and do that, right? But
feel free.
I'm trying to be proper here and sit up. But usually I do that. And I spread my legs because it's comfortable. And I wasn't allowed to. And so as a child, I started to question all of these things, right? I started to bristle. Sometimes they amused me. Many times they enraged me. And I think I was internalizing all of them. And of course, I didn't know the word feminist. I read a lot as a child, but I didn't read sort of theory of feminism. And I didn't even think of the word feminist until a friend of mine said to me as I was arguing with him, he said, you're a feminist.
But he wasn't trying to be kind.
Oh, he meant it like it was an insult. Really, it was you should have seen his face. Because he was just like, my God, you're a feminist. So then I thought, yes, that's what I am. That's the word.
In fact, you insist in the use of the word.
I do. I do because, but I don't want to sound sort of flippant. I know that it's a word that's loaded with a lot of negativity. I know that in many ways, it's a bad word for some people. I know that there are women and men who are uncomfortable calling themselves that because I think that feminism has, in many ways, become synonymous with the most extreme version of it. So people say you're angry, you don't shave, you hate men, that sort of thing. Or as a family friend in Nigeria said to me, he said, feminists are women who are just not happy. Which, anyway. But I insist on it because, well, two reasons. Because the dictionary meaning works for me, a person who believes in equality of men and women. Because I think it's a word that we should take back. We should take back that word. We should, sometimes words that have been loaded with negative meaning, you can remake them. And I want to be part of that process. But the third reason as well is that I think we need to name the problem in order to solve, hopefully, the problem. There are people who have said to me, why do you call yourself a feminist? Why don't you just say humanist? To which I say, the problem is not humanity. The problem is that women, the race that is referred to as the feminine race, have, since the inception of humankind, been oppressed, repressed, for no other reason that they are women. And we need to call it that. We need to focus on that. In some ways, it's like a man who goes to the doctor, and the doctor says to him, you have a problem with your prostate. You know what the prostate is, the prostate gland, yeah. And then the doctor says, I'm going to give you medicine for your prostate. And the man says, no, I just want medicine for my whole body. Nobody does that, right? You want to solve the particular problem. Yeah. So in some ways, saying to feminists, don't call yourself that, for me is a way of closing down the conversation. And I think it's also a denial, because when you do that, it becomes very vague and very watery, and then it means that you don't have to talk about what the problem is. I believe very much in naming things. We need to name them.
And when you talk about feminism, I have the impression that you do it in a way, not an academic way, a way that is really close to us. You tell us stories about that. You tell about how it affects people. I think this is important in your use of feminism, your explaining of feminism.
Yeah. I can't even do the academic thing because I don't know it. I've read much later in life, it seemed to me a sort of obligation to read the sort of so-called classic feminist texts, which are all, of course, Western texts. I knew some of them were interesting, some I couldn't finish. Some I didn't necessarily even relate to, right? But for me, I think I believe in stories. I believe in the power of stories. And I'm also not very interested in feminist theory. I do think that it can be important. I think that academic feminism has done some good work. But sometimes it can become about splitting hairs and sort of deciding what language you should use and who has used the language properly and who hasn't. And I am just dreaming of a different world. I want us to change the world. And I think maybe that the reason that my speaking about feminism has resonated with some people is that it gives language, accessible language, to some things that women already know. I'm not telling women anything new. Women know this, women know it from their own experiences. It's, women know. But suddenly I think it's the idea that it's been given voice in a language that they can access. It's not sort of jargon. It's not theory.
And feminism being everywhere for everybody.
Yeah.
For example, in a song from Beyoncé.
Yeah.
I think you appear in the song Flawless, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny that you're like, I think it's called Flawless. I think that there's some people who know Beyonce's song who would never have known it. Would you think you would have known that song otherwise?
Maybe not.
No, I think, and there was a bit of criticism from, and this, to my knowledge, the people that I know, mostly academics, who felt that I should not have said yes to my words being used in Beyonce's song because somehow this was a bad thing. I mean, nobody's quite made the case for me why it's a bad thing.
Yeah, why is it?
I don't know.
I don't know, okay.
But I remember thinking that for me, the goal of feminism is that we get to the point where we no longer need feminism. And so we should all be feminists today so that in 100 years, nobody would need to be feminist because the world will be just and equal. And I think to do that, for me, feminism is not about having arguments it's really about changing the world. And to do that, we have to reach people. It has to be a mass grassroots movement. We have to have people in different parts of the world, in different classes, different areas, talking about it. And so for me, saying yes was really a way of hoping that young people who love Beyonce, who listen to her music, would suddenly stop and say, wait, what's this whole feminism thing? And I do think it's happening. I think that there are young women who would never have thought of that word, who are identifying as feminist. There are young men who are suddenly thinking about gender. Because what continues to amaze me is how oblivious men and boys can be to things that seem quite clear and obvious. Mm-hmm. And so, I know that there are people who then went and listened to the talk after Beyonce used it, and I think that for some people it was sort of like, oh, right, I kind of see that it's a problem. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing. If it starts conversations, if it starts a process in which people start to challenge norms and ideas, if it gives young girls the kind of emotional energy to say no to certain things that are harmful to them, I think that's a good thing.
Is this the reason why you did that TED Talk? Because you had the need to bring it, to talk about it?
Yes, right. So it was my dream, but I really honestly didn't think that anybody would care. Mm-hmm. So this is true. I'm very happy.
You were so wrong, sorry.
I know, and I'm happy that it's happened, but I didn't think it would happen because of what we talked about earlier, which is that feminism is such a bad word. And when I was asked to give the talk, it was the TED Talk was organized by my friend, and so he said to me, come and talk. He said, because you have a following from the first TED Talk that you gave. I gave a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. And I said to him, and this was a TED conference that was focused on Africa. So it was an auditorium filled with Africans and friends of Africa. And I said to him, I don't really have anything else to talk about. I've already said what I care about, which is the importance of many stories. he said to me, well, but there is that thing that you always lecture us about. And honestly, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, what? And he said, feminism. So apparently, you know, in the way that we can be, I guess I wasn't even self-aware enough to know that in my family and with my friends, I was known for lecturing people about women's equality. I had no idea. So I started laughing, and I said to him, all right, okay, I thought, you know, yeah. I remember thinking that's the other thing I'm passionate about. I mean, and looking back now, I think he was right. I mean, it seemed to me that things were so obvious, that there was injustice, and people didn't notice, so I would often go into rants. You know, something would happen, I'd say to them, well, it wouldn't happen if she wasn't a woman. And they would all kind of look at me like, oh, Lord, here she goes again. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go give this talk. And I remember thinking, I'm giving this talk to a hall full of Africans. It's not going to go well. But I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. So I did. And I think in general, for me, it's a question of being true to what you believe. And so I gave it without I didn't expect it to become big. I didn't expect my audience to applaud me. You know, I expected hostility, I expected pushback. And so because my expectations were so low, I was really surprised when, when it kind of took off. So yes, of course, I gave it because I wanted to start a conversation, but I wasn't sure that conversation would start.
Mm-hmm. In fact, you received, people were so grateful that you did it, and they really, after that, they read the book, everything, but you also received some hostility.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Goes back, yeah.
Of course. I mean, I think if you take a public stand for feminism in the world today, you have to expect hostility. There's no way that you will not get hostility.
It's a pity that it goes like this.
It's a huge, terrible shame, but it's the reality. But for me, that hostility makes my point. Right? If we didn't live in a world in which there's gender injustice, then talking about it shouldn't bring about hostility. People shouldn't say to you, oh, shut up, or you need to prove that that this happened to this woman because she's a woman, or just the kinds of and I find it interesting how constantly the response often is shut up. I get that, and I think, why? Why is it shut up? Why don't we engage with what's being said? So the hostility, it's not pleasant, obviously, right?
Of course.
But, I can live with it because I expect it, right? I expect it to happen, so I can live with it. And instead, for me, I find joy in the unexpected positives. Right? I find joy in being told that a group of men in Lagos watched the TED Talk in their office and suddenly start talking about gender. And one of them said, when I go home today, I'm going to be a different man with my wife. So I take joy in things of that sort, right? In this woman who's Bangladeshi Muslim and her husband both are, and she said, she wanted to go to Mecca on pilgrimage, and she said to me, the general idea is that I'm supposed to ask him for permission. And she said she had been so annoyed by this, and until she got to the age of 65, then she could go on pilgrimage without asking him for permission. And she said she was so angry about this, but she really wanted to go. And so she was thinking about this whole process of, I'm going to ask him for permission. And then she said, and then I listened to your talk, and I was like, fuck it, I'm not asking him. and that made me very happy.
Well, when you did the talk, I don't remember if it was in the talk, you explained that a woman told you that being feminist is not an African thing?
Oh, yeah. That happens all the time. They're like, you've been following white people. Mm-hmm. You're reading all these books by white women. And in my opinion, actually, there are ways in which there's a certain kind of African woman that is, feminism is not something that is alien to Africa. Actually, if you go back in history, and I know about West Africa because that's the region I know best, But you go back in history in West Africa, and before colonialism, women actually had much higher, much more complex, and much, the gender roles of women, in some ways, were much better. It's not to say that patriarchy didn't exist, because obviously men were still more powerful in general. But if you look at pre-colonial Eastern Nigeria, Southern Nigeria, women had agency, women had power. But then colonialism came with Christianity, and it was a Victorian Christianity, which is that what was imported into West Africa was a very terrible white idea of women's subjugation. And of course, colonialism came with bigger guns, so, they defeat Africa, whatever. And suddenly they're teaching Africans that a woman's place is in the kitchen and in the bedroom, which actually in many parts of Africa was an alien idea. In Igbo land, for example, where I come from, it was women who were the major traders. Women were in charge of economic activities. And my father tells a story about how, also in my part of Igbo land, it was women who were the sculptors and the sort of the people who, made pots. And he said that one of the missionary priests said, women shouldn't be doing this. Women should, just shouldn't be doing it, because somehow it wasn't womanly and feminine to be a sculptor. So for me, really, increasingly, I keep thinking about the idea of crafting a feminism that is rooted in West African history. The reason we talk about feminism, and often we mean Western feminism, so we talk about feminism and we sort of mean, in many ways, we mean the Pankhurst sisters in England, we mean, in America, Gloria Steinem, but actually, the only reason we do that is because Western feminism is the feminism that has been most documented. Mm-hmm. But that it doesn't mean, so my great-grandmother, and there have been feminist movements in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, they just weren't documented. There have been women who have come together and pushed back at patriarchy all over the world, over time, but because we don't have the documents, we somehow have very narrowly defined feminism as this thing where, a number of women in the US and in England sort of said no. I think Western feminism is a movement of many feminisms. And the reason this is important for me, I think, is because I think the idea of feminism is universal. Just that idea that men and women are equal. That idea of just equal humanity. Mm-hmm. But I think the way it manifests itself is culturally specific. And I think it can differ based on where in the world we are, class, race, even based on who we love, right? Mm-hmm. Sexuality.
This made me think of a story that you told us this morning in the press conference about your mother and the chairman's sign. Maybe you would like to tell everyone about it.
So my mother retired as the registrar of the University of Nigeria, and she was the first woman to be, which I'm very proud of. So to be registrar was to be the head of to chair the administration, the entire administration of the university, and the University of Nigeria is Nigeria's premier university. So anyway, so my mother becomes registrar, and the first meeting that she chaired, she said that everybody else was seated in the conference room, and she walks in, and there is the sign that says chairman, and she sits down. And then a clerk runs up to her and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, madam," and wants to remove it because he says he had brought a piece of paper and written chairperson on it. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, madam, we should have changed this earlier." So my mother said to him, "Put that right back. I am the chairman." And when my mother told me this story, she said that, everybody was there seated. This was the first time a woman was occupying that position. She did not want them to think that the work she was doing was in any way different than the work that the men before her had done. And most of all, she said, she didn't want them to think it was any less, because that was the problem, right? That if she sat there and the sign that had been there for 50 years was suddenly removed, they would think, oh, maybe she's not quite equal to the men who came before her. So my mother was like, "I am the chairman, put it there." And I love the story. When my mother told me the story, I thought it was just, I applauded her and I thought it was very cool. So then I tell the story to a friend of mine who's an American feminist. And I thought that she would say that it was really cool and interesting. But instead she said to me, but oh my God, that's terrible. Why would your mother need to be called a man to feel validated? And I was just sort of like, that's not what the point is. Right? And what it made me think about is, what can often happen with a certain kind of academic feminism. You've read the book. And in the book, number 7 rule in how to be a good feminist is do not ever have yourself attached to the word man. So you just sort of take that, and nobody looks at context anymore. So, and I remember just thinking, but if you look at it in context, actually, it's a feminist act. But that, for me, remains, and I think about that often, and I remember actually being quite irritated when that happened. But I think about it often because, for me, it's an example of how we can become, how we can be blinded by a certain kind of ideological view of feminism.
You tell us also about feminism. In fact, I think that you have changed the way we see women also through your literature, of course, through your characters.
I don't know.
I mean, with Ijeawele, for example,
yeah.
I think that you don't plan to do that. You don't start writing and saying, I'm going to have a strong character because I am a feminist. But this happens like this. And
Yes. Which is, people often say to me, oh, you write strong women. And I think, strong women are normal to me. They're ordinary to me. Mm-hmm. It's not, I don't consider it revolutionary, really. But with Ijeawele, I think at some point in the writing, I think I was aware in a kind of maybe both conscious and unconscious way that I wanted to resist the idea of a woman writing a likable character, or women characters having to be likable. And I've seen this I read books, and I can tell right away that an author is very invested in the character's likability. And I sometimes find that it doesn't ring true to me. I think that human beings are flawed. I think, that our flaws make us more interesting. But obviously, I think women who are flawed are judged much more harshly than men who are flawed. And I think that happens in literature as well. So you can pull up a character from a novel who's a man. And, you can be, who shall I make fun of now? You can be a grown man who's sort of watching a young girl who's 13. Lolita is 13, isn't she? And somehow it's great literature, the character is interesting and complex. Change it around and turn it to a woman, it just won't work. Because everybody will be like, oh my God, what a monster. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I wanted Ijeawele to be, I didn't care about likability. I wanted her to be flawed and interesting. And I cannot tell you how many people have said to me, I don't like her. Mm-hmm. And I would like to, if it were possible, I'd like an experiment in which somebody writes a man who does everything Ijeawele does. I don't think the first response would be, I don't like her.
Americana was an important novel for you because with the 2 first novels, you felt more like dutiful?
Yeah.
This could be the word?
Yeah. I think particularly with the second novel, with Half of a Yellow Sun, I felt a sense of responsibility. I felt burdened by my family's history, my country's history, my own kind of emotional connection to Biafra. And so writing that book was just deeply, it meant very much to me. It took a lot from me emotionally. And I felt a sense of duty because I thought I have to get the facts right because, it's not just a novel. It's people read this as history. People will look at this, and for many people, particularly young Nigerians and young Africans in general, for them it's going to be the first time that they're actually even reading anything about Biafra. So I felt that. But with Americana, I was just having a good time. I mean, I would stop sometimes and laugh, ha, 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 ha. And I actually remember being worried because I thought, is it even normal to be so amused by your own jokes? You know? So, I'll be like, oh my God, that's funny. And then I think, should I be worried? Right? Should I be worried about my mental state? Because
no, this is empowerment. to feel proud of oneself.
And not to, I don't want to say that Americana was also quite important to me, right? But I didn't have that sense of duty. I wanted to break the rules. I felt free. I felt free in a way because, you know what it was actually? Because I could fail. And that brought a kind of freedom. Yeah, I couldn't fail. I couldn't afford to fail with Half of a Yellow Sun. But Americana, I was like, yep, I'll just do what I love. I'll do what I want to do. And also, of course, I figured nobody would buy the book. But because I was
Why?
I thought Americans are going to be furious because you're not supposed to write about race in a direct way. You're supposed to, in writing about race, you're supposed to be so subtle. And instead of actually saying it's race, you're supposed to go round and round until the reader is confused. And that's the way to write about race. And all of that is couched in the language of complexity. So and I didn't do any of that. So I thought, oh my God, they will hate this. And I thought that nobody else would get it because there's a sense in which it's quite it's quite American in many ways. I think it's about immigration and leaving home, and of course there's the bit in England, but it's very American in a way. And I kind of thought Americans will hate it and nobody else will understand it. And yeah, but I thought I'll just write it anyway. And of course, because I was still getting royalty checks from Half of a Yellow Sun, I thought, I can still eat, and okay. I can still buy a few shoes. So.
And there was magic when you wrote the book, because you always say that when you write, there's a moment where magic comes.
Yes. I had moments of magic with Americana. It's that feeling of being transported. It's the most magical, most beautiful thing that happens, and it makes me deeply happy. For me, really, writing gives my life meaning. I wouldn't want to be alive if I couldn't write. And when it's going well, there's that moment when you forget time, and the characters become alive, and it's a high. It's really it's like a high. It doesn't happen often enough, sadly. But it did happen quite a bit with Americana, yes.
You often say that, in fact, writing chose you.
Yes. You
couldn't avoid it?
No. I think of it as my ancestors giving me a gift. That's how I think of it. I think of it as my great grandparents, all the men and women who came before me. Increasingly, I kind of find comforting the idea of ancestors. And I really do think of my writing as a gift. Obviously, I had to work on it. Writing is both magic and craft. So there's the magic, but you have to do the damn work. And I was willing to. I can't imagine what my life would be like if writing is my first love. Writing stories is my first love. And it's really, honestly, deep down, it's the only thing I really want to do. I'm happy to be here, by the way. But, if I had a choice, I'd just really rather be in my study wearing my pajamas and trying to write.
You work in your pajamas?
Mostly.
Yeah? Do you have any routine when writing?
No, sadly. I read a story once about John Cheever, who apparently who lived in this big New York apartment, and every morning he would shower, put on a suit, and go down to the basement and write. And I read that, and I thought, really, how exciting. Maybe I should do that, but I can't. I wake up, I roll out of bed, I don't shower, and then I try to write. And if it goes well, that's it. My husband will come back from work quite late, and I'm still in my pajamas wandering around because the writing went well. If it doesn't go well, I get depressed, I eat chocolate, I shop online. I find that that's very good for boosting sadness.
Are you writing at the moment? Not now, but
Can't
are you
tell you.
preparing
Can't tell
something?
you.
Not even that? Because I know you don't like to talk about what
tell
you're
you.
writing. Not even that.
Nope.
Okay. I tried. Sorry.
I am a superstitious Igbo woman.
Okay. In which other ways?
I just don't like to talk about the things that are precious, that haven't been released to the world. I don't want to talk about, because you never know. But also because the more, actually I think the more honest reason is that writing involves a lot of anxiety and fear. And so even if I were writing and I said, yes, I'm writing, I suddenly would start thinking, am I really? Is it any good? It's probably terrible. No, I should. So it just becomes this complicated thing for me.
Okay. So let's talk about what you've already written.
Okay.
Let's go back to Americana. I have very few minutes because people are gonna ask questions. Just 5 more minutes, please, because I cannot not talk with you about racism. This is a subject that you talk a lot in Americana. In fact, Ijeawele, the main character, she discovers that she's black when she arrives in the States.
Yes. Yes. And I think this is true for many Africans and Caribbeans. I mean, really, for many non-American black people who have grown up in communities that are majority black and also don't have a sense of, I should say that being West African, because actually I think it's different for South Africans, obviously, because of apartheid and race is such a presence there. And it's different for people from Kenya, for example, because of the settlers. And so race is Zimbabwe, right? But Nigeria, no. Colonialism was a terrible, devastating dictatorship, but they didn't stay. And I think we have the massive, loud mosquitoes to thank for that. So every time I get malaria, malaria is terrible, you're sick, but then I sometimes say to myself, but I'm so grateful to you, dear mosquito. Because of you, they did not stay. But I think, it's true though, it is true. So I think in Nigeria growing up, race was just never a part of, so in a strange kind of way, I had read about apartheid in South Africa, I had read about the US, I knew all about Martin Luther King, I'd read Roots, but it seemed very distant. In Nigeria, I never really thought of myself as black. I didn't need to. I thought of myself as Igbo. I thought of myself as Christian. I think those are the two things. Ethnicity and religion are the two things that I think really sort of serve as identifiers for us in Nigeria, and also serve as the sources of conflict. But not race. And then I went to the US and suddenly I was black. And it was very strange at first. And now that I think about it, very uncomfortable. I didn't want to be black at first. And it's because I knew that blackness came with a lot of negativity. And so now increasingly in talking about race, I sometimes feel that we forget that the problem is not having skin like this, because skin like this is gloriously perfect. Honestly, I cannot, I really think so, right? I mean, I can't tell you how, if I were to be born again, I want to be this color. It doesn't crack, you don't look your age. It's true. A bit of Vaseline and you're glowing. I mean, come on, people. You can wear any color and it just pops. So, but it's not, because I think that's not the problem. The problem is the people who think that looking like this means that they can make assumptions about your intelligence, about your ability, about your, that's the problem. And so sometimes in talking about race, particularly in the US, it kind of seems to be that it's up to black people to fix the problem. But it's actually white people who should fix the problem, because, black people are like, we were just born and somebody had a problem, But also my not wanting to be black. I mean, I remember a man in Brooklyn, and I'm so ashamed now, but I think it's important to be honest. A man in Brooklyn referred to me as sister. He was like, "Yeah, sister." I had been in the US for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and I was like, "No, I'm not your sister." Right? And now that I think about it, my refusal at first to be black is in itself, I think, an indictment of American racism. Because if racism was not a problem, I would not have been running away from blackness. Right? But I knew that there were all of these negative stereotypes. I would watch the news my first few weeks in the US, and it seemed to me that every crime was committed by a black person. And the way that they were covered with such indignity. I mean, only later when I started to read and learn, I realized how differently white criminals are treated from black criminals. Right? And how studies have shown that if you're a black man with a criminal record, and a white man with a criminal record, the white man has a much better chance of being employed, all of that. But anyway, so I started reading books about African American history because I needed to understand. I really didn't understand. James Baldwin was so important to me because it just kind of made me start to see. And I started to, and so I kind of became black. I mean, America forces identity on you. You don't really have a choice. But the only choice you have is whether you embrace it or whether you constantly struggle with it. So I came to the point where I, very sort of happily embraced blackness, where black has become an identity for me, and it's one that means a lot to me. It's a political identity, right? But it's not an identity that some of my Nigerian relatives share because they haven't left Nigeria. They don't think, in terms of blackness. And with Americana, I kind of wanted to write about that, what it means to be non-American and black. Because for many Americans, it's all just one mass of blackness. Black people are just black. There isn't sort of a gradation. I mean, it's funny how some white people can't tell that we have different skin tones, right? so once I went to this event in a writer's thing, and so there were 2 of us black women. And so it was me and this other woman who was much darker than I was. And she had very long nails, and I never have long nails. And so this, really lovely old white man comes to me and he says, "Did you cut your nails at lunch?" And for a minute, I had no idea what he was talking about. Right, so I was like, my nails. And then I thought, oh my Lord, but really for me, it was sort of just a genuine curiosity. I was like, he really can't tell. Because we looked nothing alike. But I think it's that thing, there's a wonderful line from Graham Greene's novel where he says that, it's something about that for the colonial officer in Sierra Leone, the Africans were just a blur of blackness. I think that's what it is for some people, so yeah.
You know who probably can't tell neither? Donald Trump?
We don't even care.
Okay.
Honestly, I don't think black people care that he can't tell us apart. We're like, But it seems to me that he might in fact be able to tell if they are celebrities and because there's a thing about the man who is the American president that but there's something about it that's quite pathetic because there's a part of him that is so pathetically childish, where he's longing for the approval of shiny people and shiny things. So I think actually that, but it's such a disaster. It's the kind of thing that one laughs about because otherwise we would cry. Yeah.
Let's not cry. Let's hear to the people. If someone has a question, us demanaré, sisplau, que siguin preguntes, si pot ser concises i ràpides, més que res perquè n'hi pugui haver diverses. Tenim un micròfon a algun lloc i mans, la primera mà que veig és allà, després una allà, aquí també, de moment en tenim 3 i allà 4. Fem aquest ordre i després en fem alguna més. Allà, sí, sisplau.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mira, cuando recibí la invitación de una terapeuta para poder venir aquí, todo el día estoy mirando su charla que hace en todos los sitios y mira que estoy orgullosa de ella. Y quiero que ella también hable con toda la gente que está aquí de la África, porque ella se ha ido a África y se siente orgullosa. Y por último, quería preguntarle si se ha podido hacer una charla de esto delante de los hombres africanos, sabiendo que los machistas que son, y no da oportunidad a nosotros. Gracias.
Have I had a chance to talk about feminism with African men?
I think, yeah, if you could do that.
Oh, can I do that? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think she considers it would be really helpful.
Oh. Look, I think it would be helpful to talk to all men, Spanish men as well. Yeah. And, you know, it's, honestly, and, you know, I say this because, so, I think on the continent of Africa, I think sexism is a lot more overt. It's a lot more in your face. People say what they think about women. People will say, oh, you can't be governor because you're a woman. In the US, for example, and I'm going to assume that it's the same in many European countries, people are not overt. It's a lot more layered. People have learned that you're not supposed to say. But I don't think it means that people are not thinking it. Because the evidence is, we just need to look around societies to see that while the language of that kind of thinking doesn't really exist much, practically, who has power? Who holds positions of economic, political, even cultural power? Who does domestic work? Who is expected to do domestic work? Who do we judge harshly for being ambitious? I think these are things that cut across cultures. The thing about Africa, for me sometimes, is that it's refreshing to have it be out in the open so you know what you're dealing with. Right? So if a woman runs for office in an African country, there are many people who will say to her, I will not vote for you because I will not vote for a woman. But when Hillary Clinton was running for president in the US, there were many people who were thinking that. They didn't say it, but that's the reason they didn't vote for her. Both men and women, by the way. So to my sister, your question, I have actually talked to many African men. Sometimes it doesn't end well. Sometimes it does. And so I was talking, for example, about the Nigerian men who watched the TED Talk. And generally now what I like to do is I feel that if I manage to convince one man, I tell him to go talk to his friends. Because another sad reality of the world we live in is that men listen to men. Men are more likely to listen to men than they are to listen to women, sadly. And so it's going to take men to be part of the walk, right? Men have to be part of it, which is why it's so important for me to constantly say that. Men have to be part of it, right? We need the few good men to come on board and, help us go spread the message and change their brothers. So to your question, yes, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm. There was another question here. Here.
Hola.
Hola.
Gràcies per estar aquí. Thanks for being here. Ara estic mesclant el català amb això. Perdona. Tu has comentat, no, de la violència o dels insults que podries rebre quan parles de feminisme, no? I has deixat entreveure també que es reben violències quan es parla de temes de racisme, no? Que s'ha de ser molt curosos. I és com dos preguntes en una, no? Per una banda, quina diferència hi ha entre els insults o la violència per parlar de temes de racisme i la que reps, no? En temes de feminisme? I un consell, no, que et demanem és què fem amb el feminisme blanc que a vegades rebutja o no vol veure, no, les desigualtats per temes de raça.
Those are really good questions. I don't think I have enough time to answer them. So the second one, really quickly, is I don't know. It's I don't know, and I probably think that Black women just need to keep speaking, keep pushing back, keep making it clear that women is not equal to white women, that women is equal to women. I think that sometimes, and the example I use is the US because that's where I know, but I find that the political category of women, when people talk about it, they actually just mean white women. So they'll say, oh, women voted for Trump. Yes, white women voted for Trump. Black and Hispanic and Asian women did not. And that's important to talk about, actually, because I think it's an important way to talk about racism, right? Because a friend of mine was saying, but I don't understand, why would they vote for Trump? And I said, because white women are also white, right? So it's true, and it's important to remember that the privileges that white women have that Black women don't have because of race, the privileges that an educated woman has, of whatever color, that a non-educated one doesn't have because of class. And I think it's important to acknowledge those. So to the question, I really don't know what the answer is, right? But I have to say that there's a part of me that does believe in a sort of a movement that has a central unity, but has different. I mean, I don't think, for example, that we should start to construct Black feminism as being separate from white feminism, because I do think that there are things that connect us. I mean, I think being born a woman in the world, no matter your color, no matter your class, there's just some things that are common. That idea that you are socialized to reduce yourself, it happens everywhere, right? It happens everywhere. And so I think that there are things that, there are ways to connect, but I think it's also important to recognize the ways that things are different. And a good example, I think, would be to talk about the women, 57 or 53% of white women who voted for Donald Trump. I think it's a good example, because there's a sense in which if you're not personally, all right, I don't want to talk about racism in America. So the first part of the question, how is the hostility different? It's equally annoying. It makes me want to slap somebody's face. No, I'm kidding. I can talk about my own personal experience, right? I want to talk about not strangers, because increasingly the opinions of strangers don't matter to me, because I think that life is too short to battle with ghosts. And if you don't know who people are, there's just no point in fighting with them, which is why I don't read reviews, I don't read things about me, I don't do Twitter, but I don't, because it's important for me to have a space that isn't influenced by the opinions of strangers. But now when it comes to the people I care about, the people I love, my family and friends, when I talk about racism, they get it. And I mean anti-Black racism. My family gets it, my friends of all colors, right? So not just my Black friends. They get anti-Black racism. They never ask me to explain it or to prove it. They never say that I'm overreacting. They get it. When I talk about sexism with the people I care about, I'm very often asked to prove it. I'm asked to, often I will say, I'm going to use Hillary Clinton as an example, because obviously I'm not sure if you can tell, but it's something that's very close to my heart because I was devastated when she lost. In talking about Hillary Clinton, even with progressive, intelligent men, it was often very difficult for them to see that she was being treated differently. And that different treatment had to do with her being a woman. It was very difficult for them to see it. And I constantly was in a position where I was being asked, well, prove it. And it gets to a point where it becomes mentally exhausting because even before I start the conversation, I'm feeling almost defensive because I'm expecting to be told, oh, it's not really because she's a woman, you're overreacting, it's because she's da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It happens with my family and friends as well. When I talk about sexism in the Nigerian context, I'm often told, oh, it's not that serious, it's not that bad. Or what also happens with a lot of my often my male Nigerian friends, they will say, well, but what about the things that women get? What about, I go to a restaurant with a woman and I'm expected to pay. Well, what about that? And but the whole idea of feminism is that is a problem as well, because feminism challenges the idea of masculinity, where men have to protect and always pay, and men can't cry, and men have to be strong. Feminism challenges that. But so in some ways, the hostility I get about sexism makes me feel lonely, because I get it from my circle. With racism, I feel supported by the people I care about. Is it the opposite for you?
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
You're talking about the concepts, and here, I feel it's particularly the opposite. So maybe talking about gender, it's more like you get challenged. I'll just.
That's probably, it's interesting to me. That might be because, and of course I'm going to tell you what your life is about because this is what I do. Well, that's probably because you're Spanish, right?
No, I'm a Latina. I'm Colombian.
But do you live here?
Yes, I've been living here for 11 years and trying to tackle racism.
Okay.
On one hand, and trying to talk defending that I can wear high heels in some spaces can be, like contradictory. It's like, how are you defending that? I was like, okay, I don't know. Maybe that's my form of being a woman because it's attached to a context, to a particular personal story. Yeah. And for me and for some of friends trying to work on racism here, I think it's the opposite. So maybe.
But I think maybe it's because this is a country. I think many countries in Europe have trouble accepting that there is such a thing as Black Europeans.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel as though, right? So our contexts are different. So my context is one in which Nigeria obviously is mostly Black and race is not an issue for us. And in the US, race is an issue, but at least, there's kind of an understanding that there's such a thing as a Black American, right? So that it becomes part of the conversation. I can see how in Europe, in Spain, in France, in Italy, in the idea that a Black person is European is something, I can't tell you how many Black Europeans have said to me, they keep asking me where I'm from. And, and I was born here, and all my cultural contexts are in this country, but they keep asking me. And I'm like, I don't mean to laugh. I don't mean to diminish it. I think it's a serious thing. But the thing about racism is that it can be so absurd, And often I think about the way that colonialism works, right? So even in England, they had trouble. There was sort of a kind of a political shift in which the expression Black British was coined because there were people who felt that English meant white. So Black British became a kind of sort of the middle ground that was safe, which, in some ways I understand, but I thought, why? But there's some Black people who really are English, incredibly, ridiculously English. The kind of Black people I'm talking to, and I'm like, oh my Lord, I don't even understand you, right? But I can see how our contexts are different, and I think that's why.
There was...
Yeah. Good luck.
The first one here, who was it? Tu, Vale. Podeu fer només una pregunta per persona, sisplau, perquè com sou molts, així és més just per tothom.
Vale. Doncs la pregunta és, en moltes converses que tinc de parlar del feminisme i això, el problema que més m'he trobat és que molta gent, homes i moltes dones també, no entenen que de base les dones ho tenim molt més difícil que els homes per fer moltes coses, i llavors la pregunta és com comences la conversa amb una persona que en molts cops m'ha passat que siguin dones, que no entenguin que les dones hem de treballar el doble per estar sobre un escenari o per estar en posicions de poder.
I think you start by accepting that there's some people that you will never convince. It's true, though. There are some people who, because it's not that they don't know, it's that they don't want it to change. So you're never going to convince them. Those are the people who, if you tell them, and there are people like that about race as well. You know, people who say, oh, it's not gender, it's not race, it's the sky, right? But I think, in general, I believe in stories. I think that the way to do it is to tell stories. And you just said something about women having a harder time achieving things. And what I would suggest in having these conversations is to actually use specifics, use details. I think there's a human connection to storytelling that I think works very well. So it's one thing to say misogyny has repressed women throughout the centuries, right? And that's true. But for many people, they just switch off. But if you start to talk about this particular woman who went to do this particular thing, and also it really helps to juxtapose, because in many ways, the way that we can diagnose misogyny is to compare it to how men are treated, right? So it always helps to, use stories and to use examples. And, I'm going to use the most obvious and to me just ridiculous example of recent days. So the idea, for example, in a particular country, if you're a woman, you cannot drive. All right. That's all.
Allà era, la següent pregunta era allà. Com? Sí, però em sembla que el quart ha sigut ell, el més ràpid.
Era el quart.
Ara
Parlaré un traductor. En la novel·la Americana, els teus personatges s'emocionen el dia que Obama guanya les eleccions i es posen molt contents. 8 anys després, què dirien aquests personatges? Ha canviat la situació dels Estats Units en quant al tema del racisme?
What would the characters say? I think the characters would be disillusioned and confused, and they would probably be attending neighborhood meetings to discuss how to vote out the Republicans. How is racism? I think it's important to say that racism did not disappear because of Barack Obama, and that it was very naive for anybody to think. Anybody who knows the basics of American history cannot expect one black man becoming president to somehow make racism disappear. Racism is deeply entrenched. Racism is America's foundation. And it's going to take a long time. I think what's different is, I remember reading somewhere that when Obama was president, 1 in every 80 Google searches for him also contained the word nigger or Ku Klux Klan. 1 in 80, that's remarkable. And I think that I think that racism accounts for much of how Obama's administration was treated by the opposing party. I think that, so under Obama there was racism. I think what's happened with this present administration and with this man who is the American president is that you don't have to hide racism anymore. With Obama, there was kind of, people sort of tried to hide it and to pretend. But not with this person. Now it's okay, you can, and you can, now the language of racism is the language of nationalism. You talk about racism and you couch it in the language of you being a patriot and being, America first. And I don't know if you know about the football players, American football, and how somehow if you're a black American, you don't really have the same rights as everybody else because you have to be grateful and shut up, and you can't speak, really, because that's what it is. So I think that's really the way that it's changed, that it's become out in the open, and it's okay. And there's really, you don't have to worry about consequences in the way that I think people kind of worried before, because now, if you have the leader of a country who himself is racist, then racism becomes okay.
We still have time for 2 more questions, but I can choose. Do you want to choose?
No.
I don't want to be responsible for that.
There's a woman there. Yes, we need a man. We need a man.
La
This
noia
is true.
callada.
Yeah. This is true. We haven't. Oh, we did have a man. Oh, yeah. Another woman.
We can have another one.
Then I go first. Okay. Kedus?
Okay.
Okay. So you told us before about the OG episode, the kola nut, the breaking of the kola nut. So I have a very important question. Have you been made the chief in Igbo land?
I see that you know a bit about Igbo land. Have you been?
Yes, my husband is from Anambra.
Ah, where in Anambra?
Uga.
Ah, onye Uga. Gini ayibia.
Oh, no. You can speak Pidgin to me, but Igbo will be hard. And my second question to you would be, were you allowed to speak Pidgin when you were a child? And have you ever thought about writing in Pidgin?
No.
Because I've heard you talking about why you don't write in Igbo, but I've never heard about Pidgin.
Well, I don't write. I mean, I do write. I write Igbo well, and I am going to write in Igbo. And so it's not so much that it's simply that because we are educated in English in Nigeria, so and Igbo people in particular cannot read Igbo. I mean, in general, Igbo people read English. Pidgin, I wasn't expected to speak Pidgin because Pidgin is gender and class based in Nigeria. Pidgin is very boy in my part of Igbo land. I think in the Niger Delta region, Pidgin is kind of more like a lingua franca. People speak Pidgin even at homes. But growing up, Pidgin was not just sort of something that boys did, but it was considered low class. And so to even speak Pidgin at home, I mean, that's inconceivable. I mean, my father, it's funny, I was just talking to my father a few days ago, and I was teasing him, and I said, Daddy, do you even understand Pidgin? And he said a little bit. And I said, can you speak? And he very quickly said, of course not. You know, he's a professor, of course he doesn't speak Pidgin, which I find hilarious because in some ways, it's also a way to survive in Nigeria, right? Pidgin. So no, Pidgin doesn't even really interest me in that way. It's writing in Igbo that interests me, not Pidgin. And Pidgin is something that's, I mean, obviously I can speak because I have to speak in certain situations, especially when a policeman stops me on the road. So I'll be like, oh, God, how you doing now? How life? That kind of thing. But in general, it's not really a language I speak with anyone. So it's not natural to me. And have they made me a chief? They were supposed to 2 Christmases ago, but I couldn't go back because I was sick. And yeah, maybe this year. I mean, it's open, and I already know my title, Adadiorama. So, by the way, for people who don't understand, it means the next time I come to Barcelona, you all have to bow when I. I'm not kidding.
So the next question is for him.
I think we already had a man. I want to tell a very quick story about a study that somebody told me about. So it was a primary school teacher, elementary school in the US, and he wanted to do an exercise on gender because he had noticed that the boys, when girls started to talk, the boys would talk over them. And so he decided to keep a note and decided to call on girls to speak, and because the boys were always speaking. And he said he did this for 2 days, and suddenly the boys started to complain, and the boys said, oh, you never ask us to speak. But he said, that's not true. It's just because now I ask as many girls as boys. But because you're so used to dominating the space, you see that as injustice to you, but it's just equality. And I'm saying this as preface to say that we've already asked one man, and men always speaking the wall, so woman now, please. We need to balance things out. There's a woman.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you, to see you. It's very, I'm a black Spanish woman born in Madrid, but lived in Catalonia all my life. And I'm speaking, I just very briefly wanted to tell you that for the past few years here in Barcelona, especially in Madrid, in Catalonia, there is a whole movement of African, Catalan, Spanish people trying to find our own identity as Spanish, Catalan, or you know, or whatever, no? But what I found as a Spanish woman is that sometimes I have to be the speaker of my whole race, of the race, you know? Do you feel like that as a writer, as a black writer, and as an African writer? How do you feel about that?
I don't, because I refuse to. There are people, I know that there are expectations. There are people who know very little about Africa. I know that there are people, I know that now that I'm widely read, I know that there are many people for whom my book is the only introduction to Africa. And there are people who still today ask me things about places just because it's Africa doesn't mean I know anything about it. I mean, there's so much about Nigeria that I don't know. Well, people expect me, you're an African, so why don't we discuss the problem in Zimbabwe? Yeah, and I'm like, no, I don't really want to discuss the problem in Zimbabwe. So, and I understand that, but it's also about how one chooses to react to it. I push back all the time. And I don't carry that as a burden because it's not something I have accepted. I do not represent Africa. I am a very happy African, but I don't represent Africa. And Africa is incredibly diverse. And even Nigeria, I mean, there are people who've said to me, oh, you represent your country. And I said, you need to go back to Nigeria and see how many people do not agree with me at all. Right? So I can't possibly represent Nigeria. But I understand what you're saying. And I think it's something that a lot of black people experience when they're in spaces that are majority non-black. You kind of become the black person, and everybody turns to you to explain. It's as though black people have a secret society of blackness where we all kind of know everything about one another, but we don't. And in some ways, it's like that American man who could not tell that I looked nothing like the other black woman. Right? Can we take? There's a woman who just was very. One last question. Yeah, there's a woman who. She was pushing.
Thank you so much for coming to Barcelona. So my question is more like the writing creativity, not like really feminism, more like the writing process. So I have my mom here with someone I really admire, and I think that her stories, like everything she's been through is just amazing. And I know you as an amazing writer. Is a writer born or is a writer made? I'm not a writer. I write things that I feel and I think about, but I've never written any story. But I don't want my mom's stories to go without being written or being shared with the world. So I don't know how, like, am I the one to write a story for her? Or how do you make the writing process? Like, do we write together? And I always tell Mom, you have to write this. You have to tell people about your story. You have to be motivated. She's an amazing motivator. And I don't know how, but, like, is there a way to say, we're going to write a story today, we're going to do this? And how do you create a story? How do you choose the characters? It's a personal story because it's your life. But I don't know, like, I don't know anything about writing. I have a YouTube channel. Yes, I make videos about inspiring youth and scholarships because I like to travel and making people get information. But I don't know like how to help her to get that story outside because I think she would motivate so many people because I am who I am today because of my mom. Aww. So.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm Yoruba. I'm Nigerian Yoruba. I was born in Nigeria, but we came to Spain when I was 10. So I'm African European, as you said before.
I want to say how lovely it is to hear a woman talk about admiring her mother. I think it's such a beautiful thing. Stories. I think you should, first of all, just record them. Have her talk and record them so you have that material. Yeah? And then writing is something that you can learn. I mean, if you care about it enough, you can do it. So the question about whether writers are born or made, I think both. I think there's some writers who start very early, and I think there's some writers who come to it when they're older. And I think maybe the one thing that is consistent is that they care about it. I mean, you have to care enough. Writing is not easy. You have to care enough to dedicate the time to it. There are many things. When I was writing Purple Hibiscus, for example, I was an undergraduate, and there were many things I was very happy not to do. I didn't hang out because I wanted the time to write, because writing mattered. You have to devote time to it. Writing sucks your time. And my sense is that you're not ready yet to tell your mother's story, and when you're ready, you will do it. I was kind of hoping that when you said you had a YouTube channel, I was kind of hoping that it was about natural hair. So I was disappointed that it was about motivating people.
Fins aquí la conversa. Sí que ara ella signarà llibres. Ho farà aquí. Podeu fer la cua? Començant aquí. Un moment, sisplau. Sisplau. La Laie estarà venent llibres allà i jo crec que sobretot el que hem de fer és donar-li les gràcies. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.